You are listening to the Airline Selection Podcast, where we bring you insights to help you succeed at airline selections. This podcast is brought to you by Airline Selection Program. Please welcome your host, airline captain and major airline recruiter, Guillaume Debauchez.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Airline Selection Podcast, where we help you succeed at airline selections with tips, news and stories from our guests. And today we have Calvin Shields with us. Calvin, how are you doing today?
Hi, good morning, Guillaume. Very well, thank you.
Excellent. So Calvin, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, I thought the viewers might be interested in how security has evolved over the years from when I first started to today. In the early days, there was very little security. There were no, as a matter of interest, there were no jetties on the airfields either. So we just often walked out to the aeroplane. There were fences around the airfields, but in the terminal, the passengers were only subjected to a questionnaire to say were they carrying any dangerous items. So it was a very relaxed sort of atmosphere. Compared with today, of course, one of the worst things about flying today, of course, is having to stand in line in security for half an hour. So Absolutely. It was very different in those days.
Absolutely. And so let's, for our viewers who are maybe just starting their aviation career, let's explain the difference between safety and security, right? So correct me if I'm wrong, Calvin, but security is you going through this line, getting your baggage x-rayed, showing your passport to the police and getting through the other end. And on board, of course, making sure of this as well. Doing your walk around, making sure that no one's kind of hiding in the landing gear and things like that. And safety is the safe operation of the flight from a flying perspective. Am I right?
Absolutely correct. I'm really talking about the security. In other words, as some sort of insurance against terrorist attacks, or let's say people who want to get on the aeroplane for reasons which they're not supposed to be.
Excellent. So talking about security today, so you're going to take us through how it was in those days and how it became, of course, leading to the massive changes of September 11. So like you were saying, in the early days, no jet bridges, no jetties, and no X-ray machines?
No, definitely no X-ray machines at all. And as I said, really, it was up to the passenger to declare whether they were carrying any guns or knives or dangerous articles. And very little, if you like, security as we would see it today. But there was no real need for it in the beginning. But at the beginning of the 70s and at the end of the 60s, 70s, the world was quite similar today in terms of the political situation. And as such, of course, BOAC, British Airways, and Air France and Lufthansa and so on, they were flag carriers for their own countries in many ways. So extremists and terrorists often targeted aeroplanes because those aircraft actually were effectively representing the company that they flew for.
Indeed. So what happened? So when you started your career, how was it then?
It was very relaxed, actually, very relaxed indeed. You could just literally walk out of the aircraft at the end of your trip, walk down the steps, go straight to the office, and you were on your way home. There was no security whatsoever. But unfortunately, I believe it started in the late 60s in America, a fair number of incidents occurred when passengers blew up airplanes to collect insurance. Yes, so that actually started a little bit of security awareness, but it didn't really permeate into Europe until during the 70s. There was a terrorist group called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and they were responsible for hijacking a few aircraft. Now, hijacking meant that terrorists or hijackers got onto an aeroplane one way or another, and then forced it to a destination where they would use the aircraft and the passengers as hostages to their demands.
Right, and so I think there was at some point an inflection where ill-intentioned groups realized that they could actually use the aircraft in general, as a way of hijacking, and it was very strong from a mediatic point of view. But of course, it was very risky because now they were also the center of attention in the sense that they were in an enclosed space. So of course, getting away from it was difficult after they attempted the crime, so to say. But so from before there was no hijack, and all of a sudden there were many hijacks. Is that correct?
Yes, I think, yeah, absolutely. After one successful hijack, I can't say which one it was. They suddenly, I think these terrorist organizations realized that exactly as you say, the media attention on something like an aeroplane, everyone, it's very visual. You blow up an aeroplane, it's a very visual thing to do and very dramatic and therefore very attention grabbing. And so it would highlight their causes. And so it became almost the thing to do was to hijack an airplane. It wasn't just the PLO. There were some terrorist organizations in Germany and other countries who hijacked aircraft quite successfully. In BOAC and ultimately BA in 1974, we had 4 VC-10s were hijacked between 1970 and 1974. One of the most famous was when 3 aircraft were hijacked in the air and were forced to land in the Middle East somewhere in a place called Dawson's Field. There was Swiss Air, Pan Am, which was an American airline, I think it was Pan Am, and BOAC all landed at this desert strip. And the passengers were taken off and used as hostages, and they then blew all 3 aircraft up. And you'll be able to find that on the internet if you look for Dawson's Field. It's really quite dramatic as they blow up these 3 aircraft. No one was killed, but then the passengers were involved in a very frightening month or so as they were moved around the Middle East because they were still hostages. Normally, hostages were taken to try and release fellow terrorists who had been captured. That was, I think, the main reason. And also, of course, very much so to highlight the problems associated with the hijackers' cause.
But so this one was a coordinated attack then?
Oh, very much so, yes. As I say,
I didn't know that before September 11. I didn't know there were had been coordinated attacks.
Absolutely correct. And I mean, it takes a lot of planning to be able to land 3 aircraft in a disused strip. I mean, it was a desert strip at the same time. And yes, they did. And I think they became more and more sophisticated in that respect. Some hijackings, of course, were perhaps a little bit less well organized. And of course, you could have a mental patient, or you could have somebody who has a grievance, a lone wolf hijack. They did occur, but the most dramatic ones were those organized by these terrorist groups, and particularly the PLO.
So you were on the line when this happened, so between 70 and 74. What measures did British Airways take to prevent people from getting on board the plane with guns or explosives?
It was a gradual process. I think in many ways it actually was the airline industry and in general was quite slow to react to this. The way that it initially was done was to put more security around the aircraft. I don't remember that the security inside the terminal increased that much initially.
Right.
I think towards the end of the 70s is really when it changed. But as far as the crew were concerned, we were actually taught to negotiate with the hijackers. In other words, if you can imagine the scenario where, as we've seen it in the movies, where the hijacker holds a gun to the stewardess's head or the steward's head, demanding to come into the flight deck. Well, the flight deck door was never locked anyway, and the flight deck door was very flimsy. You could easily kick it in. We were taught to open the door, if you like, not that they couldn't have come in, and negotiate with the hijackers to establish some sort of rapport. And we did it in the simulator. We had briefings on it. We had psychiatrists discussing this, and we would have to attend a security briefing where they would show us how to negotiate, but never to actually give away, never to become too friendly. Always try to keep some sort of authority over the hijackers, but try and negotiate with them. And I think in a couple of hijackings that was relatively successful, but of course it all changed after 9/11.
But so the state of the radio technology then, if from the flight deck at the end of the 70s, you could talk VHF, or you could use VHF, you could use Stockholm radio, I guess. What could you use to talk back to contact the company if you wanted to be put in touch with a negotiator? Could you do that? Was there a way?
Yes, VHF, as you know, has a fairly limited range. Generally, air to ground, the maximum would be about 200 miles, more like 150. But of course, we relied very heavily for communication on HF radio, and of course, BA and British Airways, and BOAC, they have their own dedicated HF frequency, so we could call up company on HF.
Right.
Oh yes, we used that right the way up until the mid, well, I would say even the late 90s, we were using HF to call company. Also, there were, as you mentioned, these other commercial stations such as Stockholm Radio, where you could phone up and they could patch you through to a landline anywhere you wanted to. So yeah, we could always be in communication, and of course that was pretty important because the hijackers would be demands needed to be relayed to the government or the authorities. Otherwise, the whole thing would have just fallen apart.
Yeah, exactly. And just for our viewers, so today communication with company, so with your airline basically, and with what would be called network control in some airlines, basically someone who sits there in front of the big glass wall with all the network and some specialists behind, some dedicated engineering team for each fleet, and some specialized type of controllers everywhere. In this big control room, basically there is a high-level manager on duty, always there, who has the authority to make decisions together with you. You will have the final word, but they will tell you what the company wants you to do. They will tell you that. Then you do what you can do and what you want to do with your captain's authority, of course. But of course, you will take into consideration what they want to do, and they will also help you out a lot if you need help. And so today, reaching these people is mostly done for what is routine. It can be done by ACARS. You type a message into an interface, message gets sent, you get a message sent back, which you can print if you want. Or if you need to talk to them, you'll use the SATCOM. So you pick up the receiver and it goes through satellite, and the communication is relatively clear to a point. And so what Calvin was explaining, in those days, you would use HF, which I didn't know you would do that. And because today HF is so garbled, you could pick up Mumbai communications when you're in the middle of the Atlantic, and it's all very, tricky. And how did you manage the doctors then? Did you have the doctors on HF as well?
No, not in those days. As you know, of course, now you can get dedicated aviation doctors on SATCOM if you have an issue on the aeroplane. Yeah. No, we didn't. We didn't at all. The crew, we had a very sophisticated medical kit on the aeroplane, and the cabin crew were trained to use it. We even had Class A drugs in there, such as morphine and so on. But the cabin crew... Right. And by the way, to open it, the captain had to give his permission to open it to be used at any time it was needed. Yes. But the crew, I believe the cabin crew in those days were trained to a much greater depth than they are now in first aid and minor medical procedures. So no, the way we did it, of course, which hasn't changed, is that if we had a problem on the aeroplane, we would make a PA for a doctor to come and help.
Hoping they hadn't enjoyed too much of their onboard champagne.
In fact, in the early days, it was rumored that the doctors got free tickets if they helped on the aeroplane. So certainly in the early days, there wasn't there was always a doctor who was interested in helping out.
Yes, and just for our viewers as well today, and I'm sure it was like that for you towards the end of your career with BA and with Singapore as well. You have a system called, there's a famous service called MedLink, but there are other services at Emirates. They ended up having their in-house system, which was working very well as well, where you would call the doctor for anything. Of course, if first aid needs to be given, first aid is given immediately by the crew, and they are trained for that. And they would start to call for a doctor as well. But they would then collect their vitals. So they would connect a machine or collect whatever information they could. They would ask questions to the passenger or to whoever's traveling with them, to get as much information that they would then bring to the doctor that you would call on SATCOM. Now, if this happened on the ground, that was quite good, because then you knew that passenger was going to be removed and they would not go on the flight. Passenger vomits when they are in their seat before the plane's in the air. more than likely they'll get offloaded and given the chance to travel at another time. But what's good is that the doctor was here to help and to give us the decision, and they would never take the risk. So which was very good for us. And then airborne, of course, they would also help, and they would to some point even arrange diversions. They would start to initiate and say, okay, where are you? We recommend you go there because there's a good hospital. So it was quite well done.
Yeah,
Really.
MedLink was very good because they also had information, I believe, about all airlines, actually what was in the medical kit on the aeroplane. So
Yes.
they were
True.
able to tell the crew, you need to use this for that particular situation. But before we go on to that, I thought maybe the viewers might be interested in a story. Well, it's a real life story of one of the last hijackings in BA, which I think was
Let's
an
get back to
extraordinary.
hijackings. Yeah.
And then we can move forward, I think, from there. But one of the last hijackings that happened in BA was in 1974 when a VC-10 was scheduled to fly from Heathrow, Dubai, Singapore. When they landed in Dubai, the captain on this flight had a trainee first officer. We had second officers, so he was under training in the right-hand seat. He and the senior first officer left the flight deck, leaving the very inexperienced second officer with the flight engineer on the aeroplane. The idea is, in those days, we would always brief the crew who were taking over as to anything to do with the aeroplane. So they met the other crew, the crew taking it on to Singapore in the briefing room to brief them about the flight. At this particular time, 4 hijackers rushed the aeroplane. As I say, there were no fingers or jetties in those days, so it was just out on the tarmac. And they ran to the back of the aeroplane, and they had rifles, they had guns, and very sadly, they shot one of the Indian stewardesses. She got shot in the back. Luckily, she survived. And they stormed their way onto the aeroplane, onto the flight deck, and they were somewhat surprised to see that there was no captain. And of course, this completely threw their plans, and they held a gun against the first officer's or second officer's head and said, get a captain to come out. And the captain who was due to take it to Singapore, a guy called Jimmy Futcher, a most unassuming, wonderful character, calmly picked up his bag, walked straight out to the aeroplane, and he voluntarily joined the flight. And it was a flight to hell, really. And he actually just did that. Amazing act of bravery and courage, I think. Anyway, so they took off, and what they were doing is that they were demanding the release of 7 Palestinians. They were held in prison, I think, in Cairo and in Holland, I believe. They ordered the aeroplane to land in Beirut, but Beirut didn't want to get involved, or Lebanon didn't want to get involved. They were in the middle of a bit of a civil war themselves. So what they did was that they put diggers and bulldozers and vehicles on the runway so the aeroplane couldn't land. The aeroplane actually made an approach. He said, Jimmy Futcher said, I'm going to land, I don't care. And because I have to land, I've got a gun against my head. So he tried to land, but just very close to the ground. It was at night, very close to the ground. He suddenly realized that the runway was blocked. So they did a missed approach, and they flew to Tripoli, where they landed to refuel. They let them land, and then they continued to Tunis. When on the ground in Tunis, as we mentioned before, they were in contact, no doubt, with HF and VHF, with the governments, with the UK, with obviously with Holland and with Egypt, and demanding the release of the 7 prisoners. And they set a deadline of 24 hours. If you don't release them in 24 hours, we'll shoot a passenger. And sadly, they did that. They shot a German passenger, and they just threw him out of the back of the aeroplane. Unfortunately, or fortunately, it depends. That precipitated the release of the prisoners. So the hijackers are now, I suppose, they were content at this particular point, and they didn't shoot anybody else. But at this point, Libya thought, well, I don't really want to get involved with this, and they would not grant asylum to the terrorists. So there was a bit of an impasse. The terrorists were still on the aeroplane, and they threatened to blow the aeroplane up unless they were allowed to get off the aeroplane and have asylum in Libya. This took a long time. There were some passengers on the aeroplane, but the 3 crew members were still on the flight deck. They had accomplices on the ground in Libya who brought a lot of explosives onto the airplane. They packed these in the cockpit, put a detonator in it, connected a battery, and they wired the one end of the battery or the detonator to the center console between the two pilots. And they had a bare wire, which was the other part of the circuit. If they'd touched the center console, it would have blown the whole airplane up, or a bomb would have gone off. They did this for 84 hours before eventually the hijackers surrendered and left the aircraft. But can you imagine the stresses that were on the shoulders of all three of the crew? But interestingly, Jimmy Futcher, the captain, he actually used his negotiating techniques, which he had been taught a couple of years ago, which we all were taught. I think he diffused the situation to a certain extent. He persuaded them not to blow the airplane up. And I think he was instrumental in the release of the aircraft. So an amazing story.
Wow. And so he got praised after that, I guess. So British Airways was... what happened after that with Jimmy?
Yeah, no, he got the Queen's Gallantry Medal for that. Recognized. Okay. BA probably bought him a park bench or something really interesting as a prize. No, seriously, he was a lovely guy, and he was interesting. We were talking about the characters. He was a wartime pilot himself, and the majority were, as I said, really rather gruff, unpleasant characters, but some of them were quite the opposite. There was none in between, and he was a real gentleman and lovely guy to fly with. And I'm really pleased to see that he achieved this level of command and recognition for that act.
Excellent. So after this, there was, I think, another famous hijack attempt on a BA plane. I couldn't tell you. You can probably remember when it was, when a passenger approaching into Nairobi rushed into the flight deck and tried to take control of, it was a 747, right? I think.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Yes, what happened was the captain was on his break, and he left a fairly new co-pilot and engineer. It was no, there was no engineer. Or was it? No, it was a classic. That's correct. An engineer and a fairly new co-pilot, but he was ex-RAF in the right-hand seat. Very little experience with BA. It was British Airways. When a local passenger ran onto the flight deck, I don't know whether he was on drugs or whatever, but he was acting in a very strange way. The crew had seen him acting strangely on the way. I think, was this between Nairobi and London, or London, Nairobi? It was in Africa. And eventually he went up to the upper deck, and he just, this is before 9/11, of course, he burst onto the flight deck and he grabbed hold of the controls. Actually, no, the captain was in his seat. I beg your pardon. The captain was in his seat. That's right.
He was in his seat. Yeah.
Yes, you were right. And I'm sorry, you hit me. I wasn't prepared for this one.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, he was in his seat, and he grabbed the controls and pulled back hard. And the aeroplane actually went outside, I think, the recommended flight envelope. At the same time, the captain was trying to struggle with him. And in fact, he put his fingers in his eyes, jabbed his fingers in his eyes. But at this point, he let go. I wouldn't say he was a hijacker. He was mentally deranged, I think.
Yeah.
At this point, the aeroplane was in a very unusual attitude. And the captain wasn't able to take control because he was still fighting with this guy, the intruder on the flight deck. But fortunately, the co-pilot had quite a bit of aerobatic experiences in the RAF, and he was able to regain their altitude and their flight level and their attitude. And I've seen the trace of it, and he did not exceed more than 1.5 G during the whole maneuver. And you try and do it in the simulator, it was absolutely impossible. And he managed to...
Wow, I didn't know. I thought, I didn't know it had been aggressive at that it got out of the flight envelope. Wow, okay.
I mean, do you know these, you've seen these traces that you get where we had a system in British Airways where if you had an exceedance of any sort, we could put it into a computer and it gave you the controls. And it gave you, so you could see what the controls were doing. You could see the speed, you could see the G and all those sort of things. And so we studied it. It was part of a simulator briefing afterwards. We actually played the video in the briefing. And some people tried it, some trainers tried it in the simulator, but you could see how fantastically he flew the aeroplane.
And by the way, when did these monitoring systems come into play? Because you remember we talked about the circuits on the VC10 and what you could do then, because there was no monitoring. When did that start to come in?
What do you mean by monitoring?
What you were saying, where you were able to pull from a computer the trace of what the airplane had been doing. When did that technology start to appear?
It certainly was there with the 400s right from the beginning. I can't honestly remember with the VC-10. It must have been there, I guess. Maybe some rudimentary data was collected, I don't know. But we did have a full recorder on the 7.4 from the get-go, right from the very beginning. So they would pull the data, they feed it into a computer, and then they'd give you an animation for the, basically for the trainers and the crew to study.
Yes, and this today, and I think ever since my career, actually, well, the very first airline I joined, which was called EUJet, just before British Airways, I did a few months on a Fokker 100. This airline introduced flight data analysis, but it's not mandatory. The airline does it if they want to. What it does is that there's a card that gets taken out of the airplane every day, and then it gets inserted into a computer at the office, which then will treat the data and bring the managers with information about any exceedance, and then it will grade the exceedance A, B, C, or D, or E, or something like that. And ever since I joined British Airways, it was very clear that all of these parameters were monitored, and essentially they know everything, which is how they can know if you destabilize your approach, which is the one thing they look at. But other things, such as if you taxi without the flaps, such as if you find yourself in any unwanted scenario, speed exceedances, and things like that. And one day I was at Emirates, I was flying with a top manager who told me, actually we know a lot more than you think, but we will only call you if you do an exceedance level A or B. But you may have lots of C's, and we look at them and go, well, that's not perfect, but we're not going to bother because it's part of the variability of the operation. So,
Yes,
for instance, once I got called because, sorry, I'll just finish this one. Once I got called because I was over-rotating the plane on takeoff, and it happened when I was flying light freighters. I was as a co-pilot. So, but I told them, yes, but the target pitch is 20 degrees now because the plane is light. So once I know that it's airborne, I would pull a bit more than the 3 degrees. He said, where is that written, Guillaume? I said, well, nowhere. He said, exactly. You continue 3 degrees per second until you reach the 20 degrees. And so to me, it was very useful to have this to see. He invited me and showed me what I had to do. So it's very informative. At the same time, unfortunately, it can be sometimes lived as punitive. But it's, these days, the days of flying without monitoring, they are long gone.
Absolutely. One of my responsibilities with Singapore Airlines was to sit on the whole group's air safety committee. I think it was on the first Thursday of every month, where all of think how many aircraft, of course, Singapore Airlines had. All of the data was collated and exceedances were brought to the attention of the committee, where we would go over this data. This was all fleets. It wasn't just the 747, it was the 350, the 777, Silk Air, all of them. So we would all sit around a big table and we would monitor, or we would discuss any exceedances, and that was extremely interesting. It wasn't at the level that you were talking about, if you like, looking at an individual. It was more looking at the bigger exceedances. Interestingly, the one that you've mentioned already was regarded as the most important, was being stabilized at 1,000 feet.
Yes, indeed. So, yeah, it's interesting what the airlines can do and what the technology allows to do. So gradually, from the card being taken daily from the plane and loaded, typically when it would come back to base, and loaded into the company computer, and then it would take 4 or 5 days before it would make any manager's desk. Now the data is live, so to say. It still takes 4 or 5 days for it to be pulled, but if something severe happens, the computer will pull it right away, and a manager will be informed immediately, compared to 4 or 5 days later.
If you remember, if you had an incident, one of the things the ground engineers had to do was to take the recorder out, or the data recorder.
Right.
Cassette. It was a big cassette on a 7.4. Take it out and replace it with a fresh one.
Yes, and I guess if something really severe happened, an air safety report would be filed, and anyway, things would be treated quicker. But basically, what I'm saying is the way the data would trickle in those days were a lot slower because there was a manual process involved, and today it's not the case. Today, actually, the engineering team, the one that's in the big control room with the network control, we used to call it at. Well, I'm not going to say what we used to call it because some of it's a bit confidential, but basically in the control room, there were some engineers and they had the live data of the airplanes. And if there was an exceedance on an engine, for instance, they knew right away something was about to happen, and it never happened to me, but they could call and say, hey, there's an oil exceedance that's about to happen on your plane. You may want to consider this or that, or they could do it on any system, which is great. And so when they would see this would happen, they could do lots of things, which is inform you. They could also start to tell the person in charge of network control, okay, we may need to divert this plane. And they could start to put all sorts of plans together, which is fascinating.
Yes, actually, it's strange. It actually did happen to me once towards the end of my career. I had exactly that we had a message to say from, and it was on CPDLC, it was, I think. It said, you need to throttle back number 2, or whatever it was, because we've noticed that there is something happening to the engine. And we did that. There was no problem. You could fly the airplane on 3 without any real issues. However, we throttled it back and then we just used it for normal for the approach and landing. So yeah, it actually did happen to me. Very interesting to think how it changed from when I first started, where the information, all of the decisions were just made by the captain. And there was no in-flight information coming in. You had to manage the situation yourself. Just imagine though, you leave London. I'm talking about the late 60s, early 70s. You go to Nairobi. When you get to Nairobi, even the landline telephones don't work very well. The HF, you might be able to get through to company on the HS. You were left very much as a crew to sort the whole trip out yourself. You would organize the engineering work that needed to be done with the ground engineers without any recourse to London. You had to do the whole show yourself. Whereas now, as you've already mentioned, all of this information is coming in from the aeroplane, from Met stations and so on. So the big picture is being made by someone who's nowhere near the aeroplane and helping you, hopefully, to make the right decision. But it must also be said, I used to like to make my own decisions. I did not particularly like to be told what to do by somebody else, because I felt
of course,
you know what I mean. It was just a silly little thing, but I think I like to make my own decisions.
But the good thing is that they've got a bigger picture than we do. They actually have a physically very big picture on their wall of information. And for instance, say for our viewers, say that you had a hydraulic failure fairly soon on takeoff. So you've got 3 hydraulic systems. You can carry on very well and do an almost normal landing, even if it's the worst hydraulic system that you lose, or the one that's the most involving. You could fly all the way to the end, which actually would be useful because then you will be lighter once you've consumed all your fuel. But the airline may tell you that actually, if you go all the way and land into, I don't know, Mumbai, so to say, or a place like that, they may not have a place to be able to replace this hydraulic pump. And so they may want you to return to your departure point or to land halfway where they can actually fix the problem. They've got this picture that you don't have. And if you wouldn't comply with that, you wouldn't be a very good employee, actually. Legally, it's fine, but...
Sorry, I agree with that. Actually, I've got another little incident or something that might be of interest. I was in the office in Singapore Airlines at the time when a freighter was flying from LA to Hong Kong. It was 16 hours, a very long flight, but there aren't many places you can go en route. There aren't many alternates. And then they had a problem with the crew oxygen. They were losing crew oxygen, which meant they had to descend. Of course, that means your range was reduced dramatically. And the captain called the office for advice. And it was really fascinating because 4 or 5 of us got around a chart. We were looking at all sorts of options. How long will the oxygen last? Will you have the range to do this? What's the wind? And so on. And eventually he managed to divert to Honolulu, a place he'd never been to before. But that was due to, if you like, all of the people in the office and himself being able to be involved to make this decision. And it was a great feeling to get a successful outcome.
Yes, and I think I have got more stories about this as well, but to not make this episode too long, I think one point to take away here, hopefully from the last few minutes when we've been talking, is that you see what CRM is between the 2 pilots, with the crew, with ATC, with the ground staff, and these days it's very much with the company. The company wants to be able to control the situation somehow. They are the ones moving the airplanes like on a chessboard, and they want to retain that control, which from their end is understandable at the end of the day. They have a game plan. You're part of that game plan. And it's a real CRM exercise, actually, over usually a line, even on SATCOM, that's not very good, where you've got to make efforts to understand each other, Sometimes to also get written proof of what you're being told. I personally, I was quite hot on that. I say, okay, you've given me an authorization to do this. I want it in writing. And I didn't care if it was through the printer or on my personal mobile phone, but I need it in writing, because it's quite easy to say something over the phone. But then after that, if a mistake gets made, I don't want it on my shoulders solely. I want it shared, and actually there was a technique for that as well at my last airline, which was that if you asked to be patched through the network control to the engineers, instead of calling straight to the engineers, the call was recorded, and we knew this. And everybody knew this. So the recommendation, if you have an important decision to make airborne and you want it to be recorded, call the network control. That's an interesting one. Good. So to close on security, because we still have quite a bit to talk about how we got to September 11, there's one thing I wanted to mention is when we did our walk around at British Airways, I remember they say, check the nose gear for stowaways. What does this mean, Calvin?
Yes, that's a good one. Yes, particularly it appears to be in Africa. There have been quite a few incidents where people have managed to get onto the airfield somehow, and have not so much the nose wheel, but on the 747, the main wheel. Main gear wheel well was enormous, and it's possible there is a ledge at the top to not be crushed by the gear when it's raised. And there have been quite a few incidents, sadly, where stowaways have actually climbed up in there, gone all the way to Heathrow, let's say, from Nairobi, and when the gears came down, they fell out. And there has been a couple of incidents where, suddenly a body arrives in a back garden somewhere in London. So yes, it's a security thing. Of course, when you do your walk round, it's not just checking to see that the aeroplane is working. It's also to see if there is something else there that shouldn't be there, or
That's
anything
right.
else that may be a threat to the aeroplane. So the walk around is a really important part of the operation of the aeroplane. It must be done at every single turnaround. Even
Yep.
if you're doing multiple sectors, it has to be done. It's a legal requirement. But don't just check the bits of the aeroplane, check inside the aeroplane, look in all of the dark corners. If you're in a big aeroplane, you
Yep.
have no idea. Maybe someone's put a bomb there. Maybe someone's left a big spanner there that would cause problems. So
Yeah.
that's what you're looking for.
And at Emirates, they would train us that the walk around starts the first time you put your eyes on the plane. When you arrive from the bus or you arrive from the jet bridge, is there an engineer with a toolbox walking around the plane? Is something open? Is there a trap door open? Because that trap door that's open now maybe didn't get closed properly. All of these little things they would insist on online training quite a lot. And I found this very interesting.
That is absolutely paramount importance. So I taught and still teach that actually when you approach the airplane, look at it exactly as you said. That's part of the walk around. But also, is there any engineering work being done? Are the flaps down? If there is any engineering work being done, that means when you get to the flight deck and you check your tech log, you need to look at it. You need to look at it because some work is being done on the airplane. Also, the other thing, whilst we're on that subject, never touch something like a flap lever on the aeroplane if it's not in the up position before checking with an engineer. If it's out of position, there should be a reason why. I say that. And by the way, the engineer will tie a very big warning sticker or a tag on it saying do not touch. But unfortunately, it did happen very early on in my career, not to me, but when an engineer was working on the flaps and he pulled the flaps out and he was working on it. He forgot to put the tag on the flap lever. The co-pilot got in, activated the electric hydraulic pump and pulled the flaps up, and the guy lost his arm. So it's something I've always been very careful about. So look at your aeroplane. Is there any engineering work done? Are the flaps down? Why? Go to the airplane. Don't touch anything until you've actually read the tech log to make sure that there's no work. If there's no tags on a lever that is out of place, then get the ground engineer, come up and ask him, why is this?
Yeah, exactly. And it's important to understand that engineers, and the more it goes, the more it will be like this. Productivity is everywhere. So an engineer will these days work on 2 or 3 airplanes at the same time. And you have 3 levels of engineers. You have the engineer who can sign, you have the technician and the mechanic. So they all have different authorization levels, different skill levels. And the thing is, you can't make them out from their uniform most of the time, especially at the outstation. So it's and some of them are just too busy, and they end up about to put the label on the landing gear and getting called on another plane, and they'll just forget, or they'll just I had once, and it was, thank God that the co-pilot saw it. There was they replaced a little, I think it was the jettison area, the computer for this, basically the switches, a switch box. They disconnected it from the back because they needed it on another plane they were working on. They took it out, went to put it on the other plane who was supposed to depart before us, and the guy never came back. He didn't write it in the tech log that he took it. And so when we did the walk, or the initial, I didn't see it because it's kind of dark in a corner, and the co-pilot, when he did his, he saw it and then went, oh my God, what is this? And then we got it fixed. But we called, and this was obviously an air safety report, because in no way should you take something. And the engineer came back afterwards and said, yeah, but I was going to come back. I said, I don't know if you're going to come back. Maybe you got called on a fourth airplane, and what happens with my plane then? And so these things happen. Be very careful with this. Engineers, even if they're well-intended, make mistakes. There are also junior engineers. You may have the mechanic on board and think he's the chief engineer. Actually, no. So, yeah, errors are everywhere. During pre-flight, it's fascinating because errors can happen from absolutely everywhere.
Absolutely. The statistics show that 80% of aircraft accidents and incidents are caused by human error, not just the pilots, but agencies outside the aircraft itself, exactly as you say with the engineer. That's a human error. There is no such thing as 100% error-free human. Humans err. It's as simple as that.
But the engineers tend to be, they are well trained in CRM, but a bit less than us, so to say.
Yeah.
And they don't have this concept of the linked destiny. When the plane gets airborne, they stay on the ground. So, of course, they will get blamed, but we are the ones actually flying with the machine. So somehow, even though they mean well and they don't want to lose their license, they don't want to cause an accident, there might be this little distraction because there's less of an urgency in their mind about what's about to happen with what they're doing, somehow.
That is so true, so true.
Yeah.
We could, if you like, we could go back to talk about the aircraft in terms of how we would deal. Well, we were talking about security, of course, but
security, yeah.
Also how would we deal with, we were talking also at one point, we were talking about MedLink and so on, about medical problems on the aeroplane. Maybe I could share a little story about what happened to me on a flight once. It was in fairly late on in my career on a 400. I was actually training a training captain at the time. So the worst situation is always to have two training captains on the aeroplane at the same time. But we were flying from London to Miami, and we were just south of Greenland at the time when the chief steward came up on flight day and said that we had a lady who was pregnant who had gone into labor, and she was in a bit of a bad shape. So, of course, we talk about CRM. This was really quite good, of course, because this precipitated quite a bit of CRM on the flight deck in terms of trying to find a suitable alternate straight away if it's an emergency. We needed to know the weather, of course. The nearest place was Sonderstrom Fjord, which is a very basic airfield on the west coast of Greenland. The other one nearest was Gander, which is also pretty desolate in Newfoundland, and so on. So the co-pilot, who was a training captain, he started to get all of this information. And I told the chief steward, can you make a PA? So he made a PA, and we found a doctor. Fortunately, he was Italian and he didn't speak English, but fortunately we had a steward who did. And it very readily became apparent that this woman was in major danger. She should never have been on the flight. I can't remember the number of weeks. That's 35 or 36 weeks pregnant, and you're not allowed to fly. But she had somehow managed to get a piece of paper from a doctor to allow her to fly. However, the doctor said effectively the baby was breech and her life was in danger. At this point, we had to make a decision. Are we going to go to Sonderstrom Fjord, or Kangerlussuaq as it's known now? But we also knew that there was very limited hospital facilities in Kangerlussuaq. So we made the decision to continue to Gander. But we were still over max landing weight, even though we were 2 hours, 3 hours into the flight. So we had to dump fuel And we landed in Gander in appalling conditions. And we luckily, they didn't have any steps that would reach the aeroplane. They had no facilities there, but they did have a catering, one of these telescopic catering trucks that came to the two-door, the second door on the right-hand side of the aeroplane. And they managed to get the girl or the woman off, and she had the baby actually on this catering truck. And that was it. She was taken to hospital. There are big hospitals in Gander, so that was fine. The problem then was we're diverted. We're okay on flight time limitations, but we're a bit tight. And we started refueling the aeroplane, and the jettisoning valve was stuck, and we couldn't. So we were stuck in Gander until they were able to fix it. As a little side note, we had the Prime Minister of the Bahamas on board at the time. He was going to Miami and then to Nassau or somewhere to go for an election, and he was stuck on the aeroplane with us. He missed his own election. But that's the thing about long haul flying, or any flying really, is that it's not 100% guaranteed that you'll stick to your plan. And as a result, as a pilot, you need to be very flexible. You need to understand that there is always an alternative. There is always a chance of things going wrong, and you have to accept that.
Yes, and I think for diversions like the one you had, what I know from other pilots who've had these and from briefings we got at BA and at Emirates was that problems start actually on the ground. Getting the plane diverted is actually the easy bit. What happens is the situation is so unusual to all parties. Like you, the jettison valve doesn't work, but then there could be, if you can land on a very short runway, but then not being able to take off with all the passengers or with sufficient fuel to go to a better place. And then a contingency plan needs to be put in place with other airplanes coming to rescue your passengers so you can take off empty, for instance. Things like that are complicated, or how to feed passengers in a place where you land in the middle of the night like Gander, where there's no restaurant around, and you run out of catering. All of these things make it complicated. And there was the one at Emirates, of course, where he diverted in the middle of the Himalayas and landed in China. And as the lower he went, the less they spoke English. And then he had to bring a Chinese cabin crew on board to finish the job. And when they were on the ground controller, there was no English at all. Just to taxi the plane had become the biggest problem of the day.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that there are two sorts of diversions, aren't there? There's an emergency diversion where it doesn't matter how long the runway is. You've got to, you're on fire or smoke in the cabin or something. So you're not thinking about leaving again. But of course, the majority of diversions are, as you say, you have to think about what happens when you get on the ground. And I need to continue my journey. As you say, you have 500 passengers on the aeroplane. Are there hotels that will take that number of people?
Yeah.
I diverted once from Dubai when, as you spent a lot of time there, but you can get fog in the morning, radiation fog, which is quite common. And it was particularly bad on this day. I was with Singapore at the time, and we arrived about 9 o'clock in the morning. I wasn't prepared to hang around for 2 hours because normally the fog will lift around about 11 o'clock in the morning. So I said, okay, let's go to Ras Al Khaimah. Well, I'd never been there before. Ras Al Khaimah was really quite a small place, a long runway, but very little apron areas. So we managed to land, and they had nothing there at all. And as a pilot, you are authorized to refuel the aeroplane. You are authorized to check the oils. You are authorized to fill in the tech log, so long as there's no engineering required. And this was a really interesting exercise because we had to do the things that we so often take for granted, because somebody else does them for you. But the refueling was really interesting. I had never done that before. And yet, as I say, the company would have been, put it this way, a bit upset if I hadn't been able to refuel the aeroplane and then take it on to Dubai.
Yeah, you open the refueling panel and you go, okay, so like 12 switches now. And you go, okay, there's the manual, or you can also call a friend and say, call the friend, I mean the company, and to try and get some help, or get some refueling agents who's already refueled the panel and make sense of it. But then at the end of the day, you need to be really sure what you're doing so you don't make a mistake. Once they show you where the switches are, it's quite easy actually to understand what to do. But the first time you open it, you go, oh my God. The last time I saw this was during my line training, like years ago. Yeah.
Actually, the
So
one good thing about the 747, it had an automatic cutoff. You could set 40 tons, and I think it's sort of the
yeah,
minimum
the
fuel was
777
40
had that too.
tons. So, and you could just fill it to 40 tons, and that was plenty to get to just to Dubai.
But you could make mistakes because if you press the wrong one,
Ah.
then you could fill the wrong tanks on the wings, and then you make a massive mistake. So
That was a major problem. If it was out of balance, you just couldn't take off. As simple as that.
Yeah. I think it was at Emirates. There was one in Gander and the one in the Himalayas where there were engine failures. And when I said the problem start on the ground is that they were not going to really part. They were not emergencies. They were urgent. Basically, land at the nearest suitable airport, so they had to land there. But the problem is, as a crew and as a captain, you're responsible for your passengers' welfare throughout. You're not going to say, "Well, my duty time's done. You know what? I'm found myself a hotel. Goodbye." No, you don't do that. You look after them until the very end, until someone comes and relieve you with the required authority. You're looking after them. They had problems feeding them. They had problems communicating. Who feeding them was in Gander. They had real problems with that, with no restaurants open for anyone to bring food. In the end, they brought pizzas, but then on some pizzas there was pork, and it was a whole disaster. Nothing that the crew did wrong, but they discovered this. They ordered 300 pizzas with some of them had bacon on it, and then the passengers being Muslim, or many of them being, they couldn't eat them, so they had to call the mosque that gave an authority for them to be able to eat the stuff that they brought. So usually diversions bring lots of very interesting circumstances, and it's going to be a long and interesting, but a very long day.
Yes, I can also give you. I diverted many times in my career, of course, and I'm sure you did too.
Never.
Don't forget
Never.
that. Really? Oh,
No.
that's interesting. Well, don't forget that go around is a safety maneuver. If you're not happy, go around. If you don't have enough fuel, then effectively it's a good idea to divert. Well, on one occasion, I flying across the Atlantic to Gatwick with a lot of passengers on the airplane. I diverted to East Midlands because of fog. And of course, they didn't have the handling facilities for 400 passengers. So there was mayhem in the arrivals hall, the baggage hall. So I think your role as a captain is not just to fly the airplane. You just said that. And I think it's really important for people to understand. You are the ambassador of the airline you're flying for. You can forget in my view, your own fatigue if you're not, if it's not basically an operational thing. So I said, okay, it's the end of our day. We've run out of hours. There's no way we continue to fly. I put my jacket on, my hat on. I went into the terminal with the first officer. He joined me as well. And we tried to placate the passengers. We walked among the passengers in the baggage hall to try and show that we were a bit of solidarity with them. And that made a really big difference. Apparently, they were incredibly angry before we arrived. And after that, it calmed the situation. So as a captain, your role is not just to fly the aeroplane. Your role is to be the leader of the crew, all of the crew. And on a 747, you've got 18 cabin crew. And on top of that, your responsibility, obviously, most of all, is the safety of the passengers, but it's also for the comfort of the passengers. And in my view, that means that you have some sort of relationship with them. If something goes wrong, go and talk to them.
And sometimes you'll have, and I've had that mostly at British Airways, because British Airways, as pilots who were very much invited to get into this customer service role. I had one case where there was a lady with her husband. They were all elderly, and they had an issue with their bags and things, and we led them all the way with the captain to the belt to get their luggage and to get assistance for them. I think it was, I don't remember what it was, but basically they had problems. So we went all the way to sorting this problem out for them, and this made a big difference because coming into the terminal, getting customer service done with a captain next to you, you get things done a bit quicker, so that was good. And another time it was with Roger Moore. Actually, he was he was on us, and his VIP transport hadn't been organized, so we stayed with him on the jet bridge until the transport got organized. It was really cool, actually. He's a really nice guy, actually. So so that was
Yes,
great.
I agree with you, Guillaume. I mean, to go the extra mile sometimes isn't particularly difficult for you. And pre 9/11, Colin Montgomery, who's a very famous golfer, I'm not a golfer, but he was traveling to Hong Kong with me, and he's always went BA. He's scared to death of flying, and so he loves being on the flight deck. And in those days, you were allowed to do that. And of course, he spent all of the time with me on the flight deck. He spent £10,000 for his first class seat, but all he wanted to do was sit on the flight deck. As we were flying along the Himalayas, I guess we had about 5 hours to go or something like that. I said, look, I tell you what, why don't you go and use the crew bunk, which was at the back of the flight deck. And so he slept in the crew bunk whilst we flew to Hong Kong. And he was
that's cool.
as happy as Larry. He'd spent 10,000 euros or pounds or whatever on his ticket, and he was over the moon. But what you've got to realize, what I must say from what you're saying, is don't forget repeat business. Because if you have, let's say, a first class passenger or a business class passenger, if you go the extra mile for them, they're likely to fly with your airline again.
Yeah.
And again and again. And it was calculated that repeat business for a first class passenger over a 20-year period was immense. It was, in the millions. So it's a little bit extra work for you, but of great benefit for the company if you do go that extra mile.
Yeah, and I think customer recovery with BA started very much with the pilots. It was encouraged to, customer maintenance, satisfaction maintenance, but also recovery when something goes wrong. The pilots had a big part to play. At Emirates, it was different, where the company was very good at doing that afterwards. Something had gone wrong. They didn't really want the pilots to be involved in that too much. Of course, you do PAs and you had to be good with that, but then they wanted you to stay and finish your job on the plane, in the cockpit mostly, knowing that behind that, the cabin crew were very well trained in customer service, and the company after that was quick to give them an extra ticket, to do the extra mile, to make sure they were happy, to apologize in the name of the company. So it's a different approach.
I would suggest that the way that BOAC and BA did it actually drew on previous experience where the captain, if you go back in the 1950s, was like the captain of a ship, where his role was very much to be a part of visiting the passengers and being very much part of the customer experience. And I'm absolutely certain that continued through until I left BA, where we were actively encouraged when we could to interact with the passengers. In fact, until 9/11, well, even after 9/11, I would make an effort to go down and talk to every single first class passenger, put my jacket on. When I was young, it was recommended that you put your jacket and your hat on and be very formal and go down, just as a captain of a liner would do, go and meet the passengers. It was actually encouraged for us to do that. And I continued to do that until I retired. I'd put my jacket on, I'd go around and I would make a point of introducing myself to every single first class passengers, and as often as I could, a fair number of the business class passengers as well.
And when I was at BA, I used to do that as well. I was a first officer, but then we had the logbooks for the children. So when they had a certain amount, they had, 100 hours or whatever milestone they'd made, I would put my jacket, put the hat on, and I would go and deliver it to, usually they were having their meals when this happened in economy, but you could see the child was so happy and then the parents were so grateful. This is also repeat business, and maybe one day a future employee.
I think I'm slightly concerned now that airlines tend to go much towards profit, are steering towards the profit rather than the customer experience.
Yes, and but how was it in Singapore when it comes, because BA was very much customer focused, and don't get me wrong, Emirates is very customer focused as well. There's a direct link between customer focus and profit anyway, but Emirates was more having dedicated that in a way to the crew, and so you were staying on your side of the flight deck more often. Whereas at BA, you were encouraged to go the other way. There was a difference in culture. And I think it's, in my experience, was because BA surveyed their passengers as well. They did a proper marketing survey, and the passengers said they wanted to have more interaction with their pilots. Whereas I think for Emirates, it was a cultural as well, where I think the customers sort of wanted the pilots to fly the plane, so to say, in a way. How was it in Singapore?
Yeah, it was just like Emirates.
Yeah,
just like
interesting, right?
The cabin crew were very, how can I say, trained in customer service. They were seen as being, very efficient at their job, and they were. And really, we didn't, as pilots, get involved with that. I didn't do an awful lot of passenger flying in Singapore, but certainly that was the case when I did.
So it's interesting because each approach has its merit, but you must know this, and let's talk about selections. You must know this. You go for a BA interview. You need to understand what customer service is. You need to have in mind what sort of PA you would give in this or that situation. It's actually a question that's often being asked during interviews. this situation happens, a customer comes to you in the terminal, he's not necessarily on your flight, but he is stressed about flying. What do you say? You have a delay, passengers are getting, there's an uprest in the cabin. What do you do? How do you go about it? What do you say? What do you tell the passengers? What do you tell your crew? You know, a passenger lost their glasses in the lounge. They are panicked because they can't read. They wonder if they are going to see their glasses again. What do? You call the company, you go and reassure the passenger, what do you do? There's things like this. They will ask you at the BA interview.
Yeah,
But
that's very true. And I would suggest anybody who is thinking of a British Airways career to not focus, but certainly pay attention to customer service, because that scores highly in the British Airways culture. And I like what you just said. PA was something that was really important in BA. To make an effective passenger address which was central, I think, to your communication with the passengers, of course.
Yes, indeed. Good. So this has been quite a long episode. I think let's finish a little bit on the security and lead it all the way to then. So incidents happen until, of course, the biggest one of all in September 11 happened. And what changed, which you explained very well in your book. Can you tell us the name of your book again, please, Calvin?
Oh, yes, it's Dancing in the Skies and Falling with Style by me, Calvin Shields.
And it ends with this, where everything changed, basically. Well, it doesn't end on that, but towards the end, you talk about that, the fact that everything changed, of course. And then this cockpit door came in, which created a distance between us and the crew, us and the passengers, of course. But so, do you want to touch a few words on this?
Yes, absolutely. Briefly, the difference between the hijackings of the 70s and perhaps the 80s, and of course the infamous 9/11, was that the hijackers were quite prepared to kill themselves, and so they unfortunately executed the crew on one occasion at least, and they were prepared then to crash the aeroplanes and kill themselves. They were suicide attempts it were. And therefore it became absolutely apparent that you could not let anybody onto the flight deck. And the whole philosophy changed. There was no negotiation with the hijackers anymore. You were not allowed, or it was certainly recommended, that you did not in any way let them on the flight deck, which led to this reinforced door between the flight crew and the cabin. And of course, you had to, if anybody wanted to come into the aircraft, they had to either have a code to come through the door, but even so, they would be checked with security cameras, and there's a little TV screen on the flight deck that you could see who was there. What it did from a social point of view at this particular, before that, the crew would always come up, all of the crew, even the junior stewardesses and stewards would come up and say hello on the flight deck, so you could really have a nice rapport with them. And then after that, it was only the chief steward or stewardess would vet the people who had to come up. You had to have, I think it was every 45 minutes, somebody had to come up and make sure you were still alive and give you a cup of tea or something like that. But it became quite lonely, if you like. The locked door, of course, was quite an interesting thing, because, of course, you're locking yourself inside this armored cockpit. We saw that with Eurowings when the captain, of course, you have to leave the flight deck for
German
reasons. Sorry, German wings was it? Of course, it was German wings. I have to apologize. Yeah. And then, of course, it had the opposite effect, where the guy the co-pilot was able to lock himself in there and crash the aeroplane. So, but I think that was the only occurrence where it's happened, as far as I know. But the whole sort of atmosphere changed after the locked door. The crew became fractured in terms of, we weren't a sort of a continuous crew anymore. It became us and them, those in the flight deck and those in the cabin. It was quite sad.
Yeah, which already sometimes was already exacerbated by, sometimes when there were like union disputes, you had periods of time which could last for 6 months where there were disagreements, which these disagreements were us and them, and it was also them who was supporting the union, and those other crew who were actually not supporting the unions. There could be lots of little mini conflicts like that, and now you put the door on top of that, and that's an extra layer. I would like to, in my case, the way I see, I've only ever known the door, so I've gotten used to it, and I found that stewardesses and stewards can come and talk on the flight deck. Some of them, I would always say, if you're tired or whatever, if you just want to speak to us, or you just want to come and close your eyes a bit away from from all the rumble in the cabin. Just come and you do a bit of shut-eye here for 10 minutes, 10, 20 minutes. That's fine. But at British Airways also, they could rest behind the curtain during low service hours. At my last airline, they couldn't do that. So they could get quite exhausted. But anyway, there's no perfect system, is what I wanted to say, in the sense that even with the camera and the door, when you're at briefing and you do a fairly long flight, the longer the flight, the more crew you can get, as many as if you do an ultra long haul flight, 14, 15, 16-hour flight, you can have as much as 20 crew. On a 777, I think 24, 25. On a 380, even more, I think 26. And you cannot possibly remember everyone's face accurately. So the procedure is that they have something to enter, or a code word. At some airlines some airlines have a code word that they have to say and that you set at the beginning of every flight. On some others, it's something that you have to type. I'm not going to get into detail for obvious security reasons here, but that's the way it is. But then they have to look up so you can recognize them. But sometimes you just can't recognize them. And that's the risk there, that some captains or first officers will open the door anyway mechanically. They look, they see there's someone there who's got a uniform, and they're going to open the door. And that's a risk in itself, because most people could train to become cabin crew, enter and gain access to the flight deck. There's no perfect system. And at Air France, as you know, it's enough that you have, this is no secret. It's enough that you have a flying license, even a PPL, that you say that you're passionate to fly, that they will let you enter the cockpit for the approach, which I find amazing, because at BA, that was certainly a big no. And at Emirates, no way either. At Air France, they don't do it on American flights, but they do it at the discretion of the captain anywhere else.
That's interesting, because in pre 9/11, if you had a license, you could fly anywhere in America on the jump seat. You could go up to the desk, and it would cost you nothing. You show your license.
Oh,
It
right.
doesn't matter if you're British or whatever. Oh yeah, people traveled all over America just using the flying. Not in
Even with
uniform,
a PPL? Just with a PPL?
I only assumed it was a commercial. I don't know. I
Yeah,
doubt
I
it.
think.
I doubt a PPL. But the other issue about the locked door, very briefly, why I found it quite a change, was that one thing I did love to do, and I flew a lot to the Caribbean holiday trips, is I would love to have the kids coming up to the flight deck. And quite honestly, on a Gatwick to Barbados or something like that, which is about 7 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours, I would tell the crew if anybody wants to visit the flight deck. And it was fantastic to have all these young kids coming up there and pointing out their excitement. And not only that, it made our time pass. Now, is that a safe option? I don't know. I think it was very good from public relations, very good. And I just missed that very much. And suddenly it became very, strict and disciplined and sanitized on the flight deck after 9/11.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it's like, I don't want my flight to have a problem. And so I personally like people to be quite strict with this door, and I want to make sure who I'm seeing. And I remember suggesting to my airline, please, could we have, before each flight, a page in color with everybody's photo? It's on the badge. Why can't you put them to me on a piece of paper that I can know who's here? But this didn't get introduced. It ended up being on an app. But then, of course, we were not online. It was not, as soon as you're airborne, you could not use it. But once I had to do a bit of intervention with the captain when I was a co-pilot at Emirates, because as soon as the cockpit, the code was typed, the door rang, and he wasn't looking because he had a bit of pain in his neck, and he would just open the door. And that to my mind was not okay. I had to tell him, listen, it's both of us here on the plane, plus all the crew and the passengers. So I had to use, the intervention model that we teach in advanced interview course to gradually get him to accept that. And if he's got pain in his neck, then that's cool. I'll open the door. I'll check. So yeah, there's no perfect system. I would recommend just be careful. Just be careful if it doesn't look right. If it seems that you've not seen this person before, just don't let them in. Call the person on the PA, say, hey, I don't recognize this person. He's part of the crew. You sure? Okay, fine, send them in.
I think everybody's perception and the way they dealt with the situation just reversed completely with 9/11. There's no way, obviously, after 9/11, I would have had anybody on the flight deck at all. Pre 9/11, that we would never have imagined that it would be a problem, and it was, for example, the children on the flight deck was something that was in many ways encouraged in BA at the time.
Of course.
You're in the cruise. There's no real danger, etc. Yeah, you obviously only have one at a time on the flight deck, but after 9/11, our whole world turned upside down. Our whole way that we thought about terrorism and hijackers just changed completely.
Good. Well, I think this was a really nice episode where we mixed up stories along the line of security and talked about passengers and customer service. Do you want to add something, Calvin, or maybe we'll leave it for a next episode, or anything related to this topic?
I think you and I have got so much to talk about in the future. I think maybe we should continue with the next series.
Okay, excellent. So we'll close this for now. Calvin, thank you very much. And as always, like we've done in this episode, you can see how getting this depth of knowledge can be useful for you when you are actually sitting in front of a recruiter, because you understand what we've been through in our careers and how we've gone about things, and that it doesn't, there's a life, it doesn't end on the flight deck. Your tasks and your duties go way beyond the flight deck. Understanding that is important, and your airline will want you to understand that, to feel that you already project yourself adequately into the role that they want you to fulfill. So I'll close this episode now, and if you want to find out more about what we can do for you, just go and check on online.airlineselectionprogram.com to check our various products and services that will help you succeed at airline selections. And in any case, we'll see you in the next episode.
This podcast was brought to you by Airline Selection Program, a company that is focused on helping you succeed at airline selections. Our flagship course, Advanced Interview Course, has helped hundreds of pilots just like you become successful. Visit our website at online.airlineselectionprogram.com and find out how you too can get the job of your dreams.